Thanks very much, and good morning, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to say how pleased I am to be here to open our Future Jobs Summit, and I want to thank Richard in particular for acting as moderator today. I'd also like to welcome our speakers, Luis de Mello of the OECD and Judy Spillane, who's here from Accenture. I think it's really important that we have a good range of stakeholders here today, representing different strands in society. It's an important milestone in planning for Ireland's economy of the future, and I want to thank all of you for being here to help us achieve it. Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum says that we are on the brink of the fourth industrial revolution, one that will fundamentally alter the way we live, work, and relate to each other. And as one of the most globalised economies in the world, Ireland will be impacted more than most by the force of these changes. In the same way that the invention of the seed drill or the spinning jenny and mechanised textile production changed the world of work forever, automation, the Internet of Things, advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and big data will transform this century. Today's school children, some of whom are here today, will be doing jobs that currently don't exist, jobs that we haven't even imagined yet. And at the same time, our planet is under enormous pressure from rising population and climate change. So for humanity to survive, we have to move to decarbonised economies, changing how we produce, consume, and live our lives. New forms of energy, transport, and food production will transform industries, companies, and jobs. We know from history and from economics that new business opportunities and jobs will replace those that were lost, but the transition can be difficult. We know many times in history we've been told that new technologies would eliminate employment, and we found that isn't the case, that new technologies eliminate old employment, but new jobs are created. The people, the towns and cities, and the countries that will benefit from embracing these changes are not necessarily those that are doing very well today. History is littered of examples of regions and countries that thrived economically at one time or another, but were complacent and assumed that their competitive advantage would last forever, but have fallen into decline. And we see that across the world, in regions in the north of England, in the Midwest of the United States, whole countries that used to be wealthy and prosperous 50, 60, 70 years ago, and now no longer are. And you'll know that in Ireland, with the CSO's quarterly household survey coming out only this week, that we now have 2.3 million people at work, more than ever before, and unemployment has fallen to 5.5%. Since 2012, extraordinarily 360,000 new jobs have been created, with most of them created outside of Dublin. But we need to make sure that we don't rest on our laurels and we don't take any of that for granted. We need to look around the Western world and see the consequences of policy failure, where governments and industry and the private sector assumed that the good times would last forever, assumed that growth would continue forever. And we see those places now, places that feel left behind, feel forgotten, feel left out, places that politically have been seduced by populism and the politics of an easy answer and someone to blame or just someone to hate. So we know that the advantages that have us in this current sweet spot won't last forever. And that means we have to prepare now for the economic challenges of tomorrow, or we too easily could fall backward. So as we prepare for these big changes, we have to focus on the micro as well as the macro. For example, we know that connected and autonomous vehicles are the future of driving and of transport, logistics and haulage. That future is still a good while off, but it is getting closer. So someday in the near future, transporting people by bus or by train, or transporting goods in trucks, won't require any driver in the cab. And from the macroeconomic point of view, that's a real positive. For the driver, less so. And when you think that between 10 and 15% of men in Ireland, in some way or another, drive for a living, you can see how fundamentally autonomous vehicles and automation could change not just the employment landscape, but also our society. And I think it's no good telling a man or a woman who's driven a truck for the past 30 years, or driven a bus or train for the past 30 years, that there are good opportunities elsewhere in the economy, that they should get involved in big data. Rather, we have to prepare them much earlier in their lives for that change, training them for opportunities in logistics and the broader economy, embedding the whole idea of lifelong learning, starting in schools and colleges and universities, embedding that concept that people who are now in their 20s and 30s are unlikely to have the same job for life. In fact, will probably have several different jobs and several different careers, which at the outset seems daunting, but when you think about it, is actually quite exciting. So providing learning opportunities for people whose jobs are most at risk from automation means that when those changes come about, they can take advantage of them and move on to better employment. And Future Jobs, this government programme which we're launching today, is all about positioning us to embrace these big changes and to ensure that we don't become complacent. It's also about facing up to some of the structural weaknesses that exist in our economy. We know that our economy is performing extremely strongly at the moment, but our very success is putting pressure on large parts of our economy and society, most notably on housing, where there's an acute housing shortage, also on transport infrastructure, and as well there are now recruitment challenges across all sectors in the economy. So this requires careful management and choices, and we must avoid repeating the mistakes of the past by chasing unsustainable levels of expansion and growth in all sectors of the economy. And there are also big external risks. International developments in tax and trade and changing attitudes around the world to tax and trade have the potential to affect our economy adversely. Brexit, as you all know, is a major risk. Although the actual outcome is unknown, we're rightly devoting much of our time and energy to the Brexit negotiations. But the rest of the world is moving on, and we can't afford to be left behind. While Ireland ranks relatively well for productivity and international competitiveness, high productivity figures mask areas of underperformance, particularly in domestically owned firms. Productivity isn't a term that really grabs anyone's imagination, but it is crucially important. And to paraphrase Paul Krugman, the economist, an economist who perhaps comes from a different stable to me, he says that when it comes to economic growth, productivity may not be everything, but it is almost everything. And that increasing productivity is the only long-term sustainable way of increasing living standards for our people. So we need to think about more than just gross job creation and focus on creating productive, quality jobs that give people security. We also need more flexible workplaces to retain or attract highly qualified and specialised talent into the future. I think workplaces are going to need to become much more family friendly. A more skilled workforce will have greater employment choices and will choose to work in an environment that doesn't compete so much against family time. And I think Ireland has the potential to stand out in that regard, particularly given our demographics and the fact that we are still very much a young country. And I'm certainly interested to hear from business today as to what your views are and what your company's policies are in this regard. There are also issues that are common across the country in rural and urban areas. A shortage of skilled labour is increasingly an issue everywhere in the public and private sectors. And skill gaps and demand are across many sectors of the Irish economy, so we need to get it right. We also need to be competitive when it comes to tax. On income tax, for example, as I've said in the past, I believe the fact that our higher rate of income tax in Ireland kicks in so soon is a disincentive. It's not just the unfairness of taking so much money out of people's pockets, it's also the fact that when we're competing for jobs with the United Kingdom, competing for talent and investment, we've put ourselves at a disadvantage by having a higher income tax rate that kicks in at below average incomes. And it also affects us in terms of labour market participation. So many parents, mainly women, who could return to the workforce, do that obvious calculation that if their partner is using up all of their tax allowances, if they go back to work, 52% of it is gone in tax and PRSI. And even if childcare costs nothing, 52% of it would still be gone in tax and PRSI. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have a lower labour market participation rate than we should have compared to other countries. So it's not just a case of allowing people hold on to more of their hard-earned cash. It also makes sense on economic grounds to ensure that we're competitive with other countries, particularly the United Kingdom next door, and to ensure that more people participate in the labour market. We'll also over the next couple of years have to examine taxes like capital gains, for example, which was increased to raise revenue during the austerity years, but one that perhaps now is reducing the frequency of turnover in assets and is having a disincentive effect. I think we also need to examine the whole issues around the self-employed and entrepreneurs. Over the past couple of years, we've equalised or started to equalise tax credits, and I think we need to complete that process. I don't see any reason why those who are self-employed, those who are entrepreneurs, should have different tax credits or pay higher tax rates than those of us who are PAYE. And we also need to be on the right side of history, I think, when it comes to corporation profit tax. There's no way that we're ever going to change our 12.5% corporation profit tax rate. And we're fortunate in Ireland that we have a political consensus around that. The main opposition party, Fianna Fáil, doesn't want to change it either, and nor does Sinn Féin, even these days. And there is a political consensus that we shouldn't change our corporation profit tax rate. But we do need to acknowledge that business has changed and technologies have changed, and there will be international tax changes coming down the line. And we need to make sure that we're on the right side of history and we get ahead of those, because big companies that make large profits should pay their fair share of tax, and some of them aren't doing that at the moment. In recent years, I think we've also seen a growing productivity gap develop between higher performing frontier firms, which are often foreign owned, and the rest of the economy. And we also have a vulnerability in that Irish trade is concentrated in a relatively narrow range of markets and sectors. And that concentration is a risk in itself. We have diversified a lot in recent years away from the UK and increasingly even around the world. But we know that we need to do much more here. And even if it wasn't for Brexit, we should be diversifying, getting into those rapidly growing markets in Asia, Africa and South America. We set out a vision as a government, and we call it Global Ireland 2025, which is all about doubling the impact of Ireland's global efforts around the world, doubling our global footprint. And that involves expanding our diplomatic missions and embassies, and that's very much underway already. Opening consulates in places like LA and Mumbai. Hard to believe we didn't have them there in the first place, but we didn't, but we will soon. We've already opened new embassies in New Zealand. We'll do the same in the Philippines, Ukraine, Jordan, also in Latin America and Vancouver, for example, and existing missions being beefed up, particularly in the European Union. But it is, of course, about more than diplomats. It's also about our agencies, all represented here today, IDA, Tourism Ireland, Board BIA, Enterprise Ireland, supporting them with more resources, more boots, more suits on the ground to make sure that Irish firms can get into those new markets. And also using and employing our culture to make people more aware of Ireland and our country. And I'm very struck as I travel around the world that when you move away from Western countries, our countries that don't have a connection to Ireland through emigration, it's often through our culture, through our music and our art and our dance, that people hear about Ireland for the first time. And that's an enormous asset that we need to make use of. And that's one of the reasons why we've committed to increasing funding for arts and culture by 100%, doubling it within 7 years, including a 12% increase next year. And also air connectivity, as you know, is hugely important in that regard as well. So while foreign direct investment will continue to be a cornerstone of Irish enterprise policy, we need more deeply to embed this sector in our wider economy and improve productivity and performance across other companies. And we also need to encourage more homegrown companies to grow and go global themselves. As we get closer to full employment and plan for an ageing population in the decades ahead, we also need to increase participation rates, particularly among older people, among women, and also among people with disabilities. The good news is that we can rise to these challenges from a position of strength. Through Project Ireland 2040, we're investing heavily in all aspects of infrastructure, catching up on a lack of investment during the economic crisis, and investing in all parts of Ireland. Project Ireland 2040 will improve our capacity for growth and jobs creation, including through investment in education, research, and new disruptive technologies and climate action funds. And in many ways, the Future Jobs programme complements what we're doing in that area, ensuring that we take advantage of this opportunity to create sustainable and productive jobs for years ahead. Future Jobs sets out our long-term ambitions for the future of our economy, taking account of the challenges facing us, and then translating these into a small number of impactful and deliverable actions, which can be taken on an annual basis starting next year. There will be accountability for delivery of these actions, overseen by my department and through our Cabinet subcommittee system. And that will be organised around 5 themes. First of all, increasing productivity, especially in the Irish SME sector. Secondly, developing skills and talent. Third, innovation and technology. Fourth, the low carbon economy. And fifth, increasing participation in the labour market. Minister Humphreys is going to speak in more detail about these themes a little bit later on, and you'll know that there are 6 ministers attending here across the day to hear your priorities. The next few decades will involve great change and opportunity. And if Ireland is to adapt and continue to thrive, we must start now, when we're in a strong position to prepare for the economy of tomorrow. Today's deliberations and breakout sessions are an opportunity for us to imagine the future of our economy, the future of work, the interplay with our society and the world, and to start preparing for it now. So thank you for being here. Look forward to hearing some feedback on your ideas, and I'm very pleased to declare the Future Jobs Summit officially open. Thank you.